Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Spirit of Prophecy podcast. I am excited to have a new guest to the program today for the first time, Pastor Austin Wagner. He's pastor of the Resurrection Baptist Church in Cowpens, South Carolina. And we are going to have a conversation today. We are going to get ahead of the annual debate on what day of the week Jesus died on. Every year, when this time comes around, on social media, everybody starts firing at each other over whether or not he died on a Wednesday or died on Good Friday. And last year, I had listened to a sermon by Pastor Joey Wampler, who's been on the program before, showing his beliefs on the day Jesus died. And it it was definitely a direction that I was leaning towards, and I thought it was a great explanation. I believe I texted something to him about it, and then he mentioned that he had gotten a lot of the stuff from Pastor Austin Wagner on it. And then he sent me a link to that message. I went and listened to that message. I was like, man, this is good stuff. Okay, it looks like the direction I was leaning, but I had not really taken a strong stand on, is in fact correct. They brought up some arguments that I had not thought of before. A lot of things that I had put together, they had put together. And so this was shortly after Easter, I believe. I had watched these things. And so I made a mental note that next year, when it gets around that time, I'm going to contact these guys and see if they would want to do a program on the subject. And so Pastor Wampler was not able to join us today, but I do have Pastor Austin Wagner. And so, Pastor Wagner, why don't you introduce yourself to everyone and tell us a little bit about you and your ministry?
Alrighty, well, it's an honor to be on here. As he said, my name's Austin Wagner, and pastor Resurrection Baptist Church in the great metropolis of Cowpens, South Carolina. About 2,000 people here in our little town, and I was born and raised here in the upstate, and got saved at 8 years old, and then family separated, got out of church and things. When I was about 14, I walked in the doors at Resurrection Church that Pastor Wampler had just planted a couple years before that, and God really began to work on me through that. Got right with the Lord in a lot of different areas of my life. Started going to church by myself when I was 16, 17. Started to preach at 17. And then began to grow in the Lord, serving the ministries of the church, nursing home, jails, filling the pulpit for local pastors, things like that. And then I eventually became Pastor Wampler's associate. And then about almost 3 years ago, this coming May, is when he took the church down there in Louisiana. They voted on me the next week, and we've been going right along ever since then. And so he's partial to me, which is probably why he perjured himself when he gave me credit for these teachings. He preached a message along these lines many years ago, older than the one that's on YouTube now. The first message he preached along these lines, he said he sounded like a jerk, and so he wanted to preach it again at the new church in a nicer tone. And y'all know he's been on this podcast a couple of times, and so he wants to be kind and tries to be kind. I preferred the earlier version, but anyway, so that's how we got here.
Well, yeah, we're all supposed to be jerks about this issue. That's exactly
Yeah.
what happens on social
Oh
media
yeah.
every year.
Yeah, I'm just glad that someone is finally treating this fundamental of the faith with the seriousness that it deserves. So I appreciate
Amen.
that. So,
Amen. I hope everybody that had it wrong gets saved after listening to this
amen.
podcast
Amen.
and repents of the wrong day. That's a different
Amen.
crucifixion. That's a different Jesus. That's always kind of the
Brother.
go-to.
Yeah, oh yeah. That's another Jesus was on the other day. Our
Yeah,
Jesus is on the right day. So,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, obviously we do not really care if
No.
people disagree on the day that Jesus died. You just better believe that he died, and you better believe, you better be
Right.
trusting in it to get you to
Right.
heaven. But it's
Absolutely.
not wrong for us to nerd out on the scriptures a little bit,
No.
look into the details on these things. It forces us to study those passages, which cannot possibly hurt us, and just to think about all that he did. And really, I like the sermon that you preached. I'll leave a link in the description. It was called, I believe, The Week That Changed the World. I went and listened to it again this morning, just kind of refreshing myself on it. And I liked how you just kind of went through the whole week, starting at Palm Sunday, because that one week, that a lot of the Gospels a big portion of the
Yeah.
Gospels is centered around that 1 week. And Jesus,
Right.
he had a ministry was a lot longer than a week, but that week was obviously just the main the main thing there. And so that was great. But yeah, I didn't know Pastor Wampler started the church there in South Carolina. And that's pretty neat how, you got started there and took over. That is pretty neat. And just so everybody knows, I'll do a disclaimer for Pastor Wagner, but him and Pastor Wampler, they do not agree with everything I teach on this program, but these are good guys that I have respect for. I like Pastor Wampler. If I teach something good, he lets me know. If I teach something he doesn't agree with, he'll let me know too. And he'll challenge me. And sometimes in the comments, and people get mad at him. And I always tell people, Pastor Wampler's off limits. He has my respect.
Sure.
We've met in person before and had conversations about these things. And yeah, I've got a ton of respect for these guys, and this program is not exclusively for people who think exactly like I do. I did just recently have a safe space live stream where I got a bunch of people on here who agree with me for the most part, but
Yeah.
that is not what we do all the time on this program. And so, yeah, I am excited to have Pastor Wagner on the program. And so, if we can just go ahead and do a little spoiler alert, I guess, and tell everybody from the get go, what day of the week do you think Jesus died on the cross? Is it Wednesday, Good Wednesday, or Good Friday?
I think it's Good Thursday. I am a Good Thursday advocate, and it's funny how that the vast majority of people just somehow seem to forget that that's one of the days of the week. They go straight from either Wednesday or Friday, but there's a day in between that I think has a lot of scriptural support and a good argument for. So I'm a Thursday guy.
Okay. So yeah, now the only thing I don't like about the Thursday position, it sounds like a compromise. It's like, fine, we can't get along on Wednesday and Friday. How about we just meet in the middle on Thursday? And so,
Yeah,
uh,
I
you
had
know,
one pastor tell me that he didn't like it because that meant that or why do we have our midweek service on Wednesdays then? Because because they say, well, that we have church on Wednesday because Jesus died on Wednesday, and then I had to inform him, well, if Jesus dies on Thursday, then that means the night before would have been their Thursday, our Wednesday night, and
mhm.
Jesus had a prayer meeting there
Yeah,
in the upper room, and so Wednesday night services are okay, they're scriptural.
right. Well, yeah, and that same thing crossed my mind too, because we always have Lord's Supper on Wednesday,
Mhm.
and that's the night he died, right? Or that was what I always thought. And so I
Sure.
remember when I was listening to your guys' message, I was like, well, this still doesn't mess up having Lord's Supper on Wednesday, because as Baptists we can't change our midweek service,
Right.
but
No, not allowed.
yeah, but I was just like, but then that's okay, because okay, the Last Supper would have been on Wednesday according to this, so we're
Yeah.
still good, we're still covered. But here's the dirty little secret that probably nobody wants to admit, and that is that I don't think we have Wednesday night service because Jesus died on Wednesday night. I think it was
Yeah.
just, it's kind of a tradition. They wanted to have a Bible study time, doing it in the middle of a week to just kind of recharge your spiritual batteries. Doing it in the middle of the week is a good idea rather than doing it close together. I mean, that's probably more where that came from.
Right.
But
Yeah. More of a practical matter than anything. Even though
right.
when Preacher Wamper did start Resurrection Baptist Church, we had midweek service on Thursday.
Oh,
And so
really?
I don't
Was it
think it had
because?
anything to do with his Thursday position. I'm not
Okay.
even sure he had reached his Thursday position at that point back in,
Okay.
I guess that would have been 2008. And so I'm not sure, but no,
Well,
it didn't have
a
anything to
lot
do
of
with it.
people, and especially church plants, I've known they've had midweek service on Thursday because it enables them to visit other churches on Wednesdays too, and so they can
Hmm.
kind of fellowship,
Right.
and that's nice, because that was one thing with me, um, when we started our church. You know, during those first years, you don't have anybody to take your place, fill in for you, or anything like that, and I just really missed getting to visit other churches occasionally, the fellowship, stuff like that.
Sure.
Then I'm working all the time too, so I couldn't even make a lot of revival meetings and things. And so a lot of people do that, and just for that reason. And I mean, again, I don't think it's unbiblical, you know.
Sure.
So, well, all right, well, let's go ahead and get into this subject. So, just to kind of give people the ammo. We've both said that we believe it is on Thursday. So I guess when it comes to presenting it, how would you like to start out? Just kind of laying it all out. I did like how you did it in your sermon, where you just kind of went through the week. Um, and it looked like, too, you mostly focused on Mark because Mark does seem to be the most specific. And I think one of the mistakes a lot of people make, as I was looking at this, because if you look at Matthew, in many ways, I can see where people get the wrong idea in certain areas because there's some statements that are a little vague, and then I think people are coming to certain conclusions. Where if you go to Mark, it's not contradicting what you see in Matthew, but it is more specific. And then all of a sudden we can realize things. So I don't know, how would you like to start out presenting that?
Well, in the message that I preached, I tried to start where everyone's on the same page,
Hmm.
where, the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday guys, everybody seems to be in very good agreement about Palm Sunday and
Hmm.
about that. And so that's why I tried to start with that and then kind of work through the week. And my primary goal in preaching the message wasn't just to, make the Thursday argument. Was really just trying to encourage people that as we go through Holy Week,
Hmm.
this, as you said, the narrative slows down in the Gospels and really emphasizes this week. And so it's obviously something we need to pay attention to. But the goal was so that people could kind of think their way through that week along with Jesus. And so that's why
Hmm.
we tried to start on Sunday and work our way through. And so that was the way that I went about it. And we talked about, Palm Sunday as a day of presenting. Jesus is presenting himself as the Messiah as he rides into Jerusalem. They say, Hosanna, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. We know that is a quotation of a messianic psalm. And so that's acknowledging Jesus to be who he is, the Messiah. And that's why the Pharisees and the crowd didn't like it, because they knew what that meant, for him to be the son of David.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, that's what Jesus does.
Right. Yeah. And I got an idea. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do anything about it this year just because we're about to take a couple trips. I'm going to try, but I just started thinking about this morning. But, obviously, um, we can't have we're not going to be having like a revival meeting the week before Easter and all of that. We haven't planned any of that. But I thought about doing some videos each day starting at Palm Sunday till Easter, and just taking the time to each day look at what Jesus did on those days, because there's stuff we see on Sunday, there's stuff we see on really each day of that
Mhm.
week. And I think it just one thing I've done just myself in the past, usually starting on Wednesday, is I've all and that was too kind of with the idea of the Wednesday being the crucifixion in mind. But I've always liked to think a lot about what was going on in those days,
Right.
in between the crucifixion and Easter. Obviously, when it comes to, uh, the 3 days that Jesus was dead, the Bible doesn't give us a lot of detail, but just, imagining what was going on in the minds of the disciples and all that. I don't know. It is a special week where
Mhm.
I think it's good to think about all those things. And I'm hoping to do something like that. If I have time to put everything together, just make a video showing each day the things that Jesus dealt with, the things that he did, and just try to think about Jesus that whole week, because
Right.
everything was significant, that the
Yes.
Bible records there. And so yeah, Palm Sunday, that's the big one everyone agrees on. So then I guess where would you uh, say the Monday events
Well,
are?
ending up on that Sunday, the reason I go to Mark is because there's a clear transition of days that's
Hmm.
recorded in Mark 11, and so that's why I think I kind of ran that narrative
Hmm.
through to let people see the clear changing of day to day to day, because it becomes important later on. And so Jesus, after he's presented, he rides into town. He goes to the temple and he views the temple, looks around, sees the disrepair, spiritually speaking, of the temple. And then afterward, the Bible says there in Mark 11:11, and now the eventide was come. He went out unto Bethany with the 12. And so I just tried to show the eventide comes. And so we're entering that next day. Obviously, the Jewish reckoning of a day is evening in the morning. And so he goes back to Bethany. And that was something I thought was interesting throughout this study. I guess I had never thought about, well, where's Jesus spending the night, during
Hmm.
this week? And it seems you see him coming and going from Bethany.
Hmm.
And so that would be the next place I would go, showing them him going to Bethany. And then it says in the next verse, in verse 11, and on the morrow, when they were
Hmm.
come from Bethany, he was hungry. Then he curses the fig tree, and that plays a part as well with marking another day later on. But anyway, so he goes to Bethany, and then as he returns back to Jerusalem on Monday, he curses that fig tree, and that's when he goes in to purge the temple.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing I wanted to point out too, in Matthew 21, in verse 10, it says, when he was come to Jerusalem, all the city was moved, saying, who is this? Multitude said, this is Jesus the prophet, Nazareth of Galilee. That's Palm Sunday. And then it says, and Jesus went to the temple of God and cast out all them that sold and bought in the temple, overthrew the tables. And that's what he said, my house should be called a house of prayer. You made it a den of thieves. And so when you read just Matthew, it's real
Right,
easy to get the idea that those things happen right after each other. He
right,
rides in on Palm Sunday, goes and cleanses the temple. But yeah, Mark actually gives the additional details. And so the cleansing of, so I guess the way I like to break it down is you have the triumphal entry on the donkey on Sunday, the cleansing of the temple is on Monday, and it is when that takes place. But also before the cleansing of the temple is when he curses the fig tree, which is another thing everybody's familiar with. So yeah,
right.
so you would agree. So yeah,
Yeah, so
Sunday,
that's what he does.
yep, then tree, yep, and then Monday curses the fig tree, cleanses the temple. That's where
Right.
we're at, right?
Yeah. And there in Mark, he cleanses the temple, and then right after that, in verse 19, it says, and when even was come, he went out of the city. And so
Hmm.
that's what I called in the message, I called Monday a day of purging or purifying. He comes
Hmm.
in, he purifies the temple. And the reason is because what he's going to do on the next day, he's getting everything ready for him to come in and preach on the next day on Tuesday. That's what he does. Um,
Hmm.
but he returns back to Bethany after that. And we see that again because in Mark 11, verse 20, it says, and in the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree dried up from the roots. And so Jesus seems to be going back to the same place every night
Hmm.
in Bethany and then returning by the same path back to Jerusalem.
Right, right. And so when you're reading, going through Mark, from Mark 11:20 all the way through chapter 13, all of that would be on Tuesday. So as
Right,
well, so like the Olivet Discourse, that's a Tuesday thing as
right.
well, which is so something to just kind of keep in mind. And yeah, you don't really, yeah, you really can't tell that from the other gospels as clearly, but Mark
Hmm.
does. Mark just goes into a little
Yeah,
more detail on the
right.
timeline of these things,
Right.
which I think
And
is
it's
interesting.
very concise, which is helpful,
Yes.
which that's Mark's way. It's the gospel in a nutshell. So it's straight way to this, immediately to that. It's a really linear telling of the story, which I think is very helpful to everybody.
Right. So then chapter 14. Now this is a spot here where I think it can get a little confusing, but so yeah, so for Tuesday, or not Tuesday, Tuesday was preaching day. So Wednesday, it what took place on Wednesday?
Okay, well, you want to talk about that Mark 14?
Yeah, the Mark 14:1.
Right. Yeah. So in Mark 14, it says, after 2 days was the feast of the Passover and of unleavened bread. And the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might take him by craft and put him to death. But they said, not on the feast day, lest there be an uproar of the people. And
Mhm.
so that is something to talk about for sure. That
Right.
they're
Cuz
saying, well, we don't want to do this on the Passover,
mhm.
but they're acknowledging that it's 2 days away. And so 2 days from now is the Passover, and we don't want him to die on the Passover. But later on in that day of preaching, something that is worthy of note is Jesus preaches to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, all this crowd comes to Jesus. Then in Matthew chapter 26, at the end of that day, the same day that we're talking about in Mark 14:1, in verse 1 of Matthew 26, says, "And it came to pass when Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said unto his disciples, Ye know that after 2 days is the feast of Passover." It's the same thing they said in Mark 14,
Mhm.
1 and 2. And Jesus says, "You know that after 2 days is the feast of Passover, and the Son of Man is betrayed to be crucified." And so you have the chief priests saying, "Well, we really don't want to kill him on the Passover, and that's 2 days away." And Jesus says, basically, you don't get the choice.
Mhm.
I am going, because he has to fulfill that feast of Passover.
Right.
And so they're saying that they would rather not do it on that day, but Jesus says on the same day, 2 days from now is the feast of Passover. The Son of Man is going to be crucified on that day.
And so they're saying that on Tuesday.
Correct.
Right.
Yes, sir. Yeah, and
And then that would
it's that same timeline.
right. And so that would make sense too, because if Jesus dies on Passover, and then it would make sense that on that evening, the Wednesday evening, that would technically be the beginning of the Passover. And so
Right.
that's when they're, having that Last Supper. And so, yeah, so I mean, and that was the part where I had gotten a little confused before, was on Mark 14. In my brain, I think I already had myself on Wednesday. And so I'm thinking after 2 days, it's Friday. But the Matthew 26, that's where it kind of clears that up,
Right.
and you realize, no, wait, when this is being said, we're still on Tuesday. and
Right.
and so sometimes in stories, you follow kind of a timeline in the Bible, but then it might tell you about something else that was taking place, and so you kind of back up chronologically a little bit.
Right.
And I think that was where I got messed up. And to me, while I was pretty sure it was Thursday, that was just kind of the one thing. I'm like, where am I going wrong on this? I know there's probably a way to explain it, but how do I explain it? And I do. I think
Right.
I think the Matthew 26 makes it crystal clear, how to take that
Right.
passage right there.
Yeah, and we talked about it a little bit before recording, but that's an instance when you use the clearer verses to
Mhm.
interpret the ones that are more vague, because it is complicated at times, and so trying to piece all these puzzle pieces together. But I
Right.
think, to me that makes it clear when Jesus says on Tuesday, after he spent all day preaching, that 2 days from now is the feast of Passover, and
Mhm.
I'm going to be crucified on that day. And so,
Right. Well, and what's interesting about all of this too, and something that people need to remember is, yeah, when you look at what we're reading in Matthew versus what we're reading in Mark, it's like, well, you can come to two different conclusions. Well, yeah, you can come to two different conclusions if you are reading the passage looking for something very specific that the passage is not trying to explain.
right,
And
yeah,
and people do that a lot, where we've got a doctrine or we've got something we're wanting to prove from the scriptures, and so we go looking for the proof rather than
hmm,
letting the passage tell us what it's wanting to tell us.
right,
And in both of these passages, it's telling us certain details, it's focusing on certain aspects of what Jesus did, but we want to know the timeline of all of it. And so some of these passages, they might be a little vague. And so if we want to find that, you have to find that clearer place. And what we end up seeing too is that these things, they're not contradictions. They're absolutely, they harmonize together. And it's just a lot. Sometimes Mark, he contradicts the thoughts you were thinking when you were reading Matthew, looking for something the passage was not trying to explain. And
right,
so again, if people are just honest with how they're looking at the Bible, they would have to come to that conclusion. And that's what I think is just kind of interesting about all these things that you're showing and that you talked about in your message is, yeah, you're clearly looking for a narrative, and
yeah.
trying to find these things.
Right.
But
Yeah, it's a
uh
confirmation bias, and
yes.
we're all guilty of that in,
Hmm.
different areas. So it's good to slow down and try to remove the presuppositions and let the text say what it's saying. But also whatever the answer is, it has to fit with all of the verses,
Right.
because there's no contradiction. And so,
Yes. Yes.
yeah,
And so a passage that contradicts your position on another passage is not necessarily a contradiction in the Bible. And
Right.
so what you have to do is you've got to figure out, okay, well, what conclusion causes all of the Bible to agree with itself? And I
Sure.
do. I think this Thursday idea is definitely the best. And so Wednesday, are there any other events specifically besides like the Last Supper that you would say were Wednesday events?
Well, Wednesday, in the message again, I referred to it as a day of preparing,
Hmm.
because um, you have Jesus. He's back in Bethany. You find him all of a sudden back in Bethany, which to me is letting you know that a day has transpired. Um, and then he's there in the house of Simon the leper, and you can read about that in Matthew 26 is where I have it, in my notes to look at. You have the story of the alabaster box that takes place. That's preparing Jesus for what he's about to go through. And then you have Judas Iscariot, who is preparing to betray Jesus. That's when he goes and covenants with them for 30 pieces of silver about what he's going to do. And then that's when Jesus, sends them to prepare the Lord's Passover that they're going to keep according to Exodus 12. That has to be, killed at the even and
Hmm.
consumed before midnight. And so that'd be our Wednesday. But, so preparing for the Passover on that next day.
Right. Yeah. And boy, that's another subject that, um, and you brought up some things in the message too that I never really thought about that I know we'll get into, but the amount of stuff that is in the Passover that if you really take the time to look at that and just how much you can see Jesus all over it.
Yeah.
And it really is interesting the way, how you have the people that didn't want him being taken on the Passover. And there's a lot of examples of things like that where it's like it was kind of against the will of the leadership, against Pilate and a lot of these things to do things a certain way. Yet it was very clear, Jesus was adamant it was going to be a certain way because he was so uh, in sync with the law of God, and
Right.
he was going to fulfill everything that was written in the law and prophets. And so a lot of those details, most of us, we wouldn't think anything of it. We would overlook it. We would not even really care. But boy, Jesus cared very much about all of
Right.
that. And
Right. Yeah, no,
yeah,
well,
it's
that's why First Corinthians 5 calls him Christ our Passover.
right.
And to the very minute details of what Jesus is doing, he being the lawgiver, he has that in mind, and he's keeping every aspect of that. Even to where that if you go read Exodus 12, that Passover lamb was selected on the 10th of Abib.
Mhm.
It was examined,
Right.
it was killed on the 14th of Abib, which would have been Passover. And so given the timeline that I'm advocating for, Thursday would have been the 14th, the Passover, where Jesus observes the Passover and then becomes the Passover
Mhm.
on the same day. 4 days before that would have been Sunday, the triumphal entry, and that's when the lamb would have been selected. And so, even to that detail, and then you have the Herodians and the Pharisees and the Sadducees trying to come and examine Jesus and find fault with
Mhm.
him, as they would have done with the lamb.
Yes.
Then you have Pilate who stands and says that I find no fault in this man, a
Mhm.
pronouncement that the Passover lamb is pure. And so all these things I think are important to kind of help flesh out, the picture.
Mm.
And so while it's not a fundamental, I do think there are, that God cares about pictures. That's a quote my pastor always says. God likes pictures, and
Oh, absolutely.
he wants to keep those pictures. And so he cares that they're done right. And so
Well,
that's the way I
yeah.
see it.
And sometimes as preachers, we're guilty of making pictures where God didn't make
Right.
pictures. But
Right. Yeah.
when it comes to all these things, I mean, the New Testament tells us that's what they were. The book of Hebrews tells us that's what they were. And then, and even if they didn't, it's just it's so obvious at the same
Right.
time. It's like there's other things in the Bible too that preachers often preach as pictures and types and things that we don't have any place in the scriptures where it explicitly says that's what it is, but it's like that's pretty
Right.
hard to deny.
Yeah.
It's like,
Well,
come
these
on.
ones, I that's why I like preaching the types that the New Testament tells us are types.
Hmm.
That rock in the wilderness, it's Christ.
Yeah.
First Corinthians tells us it is. the manna. Jesus says in John 6, I'm the manna. That's me. It's a picture of me. And so I have heard some times that I think that it was a surprise to God that it was in the Bible, when
Yeah.
someday I get up to preach it. But I like these. These are a
Yes.
blessing. So
Yes. Well, and it's stuff like this too that you've got to wonder how Jewish people today who know the Old Testament very well, how they can look at these stories and it's like, okay, even if you thought Jesus was a fraud,
yeah,
I mean, the way he made these things happen, you can't do that. No man can just, conform all these people to his will in that way,
right.
to make yourself get executed, in the
Yeah,
way that he did, according to the law in such a big way. It's just it's a
right.
fascinating thing, and it's hard to believe that any Jews who've ever heard of Jesus have not just accepted him because
Right.
as the Messiah.
Yeah.
It's so clear.
Yeah, and that's the way that I choose to look at these kind of subjects. This could seem really kind of academic and boring
Mhm.
and pencil pushing material. But to me, I like to look at it in that other perspective. It's like, wow, look
Oh,
how
absolutely.
beautiful this is, that God's putting this whole thing together, and we can look back on it and see that He is God and He's exactly who He said He was. He's our Passover lamb that taketh away sin in the world. So
Yeah, well, one of my favorite psalms, and this is something I like to think about, and I don't know if we had this on video years ago. My Under my inspiration, my wife wrote she wrote a monologue that my son did at a Christian school fine arts competition, and it was taken from like a perspective of a scribe, a Jewish scribe in that day, who was at the cross when Jesus is dying. And what kind of gave me the idea for it, because I'm not a writer, my wife, she can write really good, but Psalms 22, when he says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? I'm just picturing a Jew who should know that psalm, you
right,
know, hearing him say that, recognizing those words. Look how often we say lines and it triggers songs in our mind,
right,
and it should have done that. And when you look at, the specifics of that, he literally says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Which is not something people say all the time, but it's something that
right.
was in one of their psalms. And that should have triggered this psalm in the mind of any scribe. And then, as he says, all they that see me laugh me to scorn. They shoot out the lip, they shake the head, saying, he trusted on the Lord that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, see he delight him. The scribe would have heard people saying that there. As
Yeah,
he's saying those words, he's hearing those words by the people that are there. The bulls of Bashan compass me, strong bulls of Bashan beset me about. They gaped upon me with their mouths as a raven and roaring lion. I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, melted in the strength of my bowels. I mean, and then to see the blood and water flow out of him after they put a spear through him. They part my garments among them and cast
yeah,
lots upon my vesture. That's so specific.
right,
That is so specific.
yeah,
And it's just like, how on earth
yeah.
could you have known that psalm and been there in the presence of all that and not been like, truly, this was the Son of God?
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
camp meeting material, brother. We're gonna bring you down south.
oh, yeah,
Got down
I'll
with
do it.
preaching the camp meeting, brother.
I'll do it. I could preach it that way, in a way that would be effective. I don't do it that much. I pastor a bunch of Yankees,
Yeah,
and the glory spout
sorry,
never
sorry.
gets opened up in the up this far north of the Mason
Sure,
Dixon line.
sure.
But yeah, but anyway, where were we? So we were talking about all the
So
signs, the preparation
right,
on
right.
Wednesday.
Yeah. Talking about
So
Wednesday. Yeah. And Wednesday, ends well, so on our calendar anyway, they go, they
right,
observe the Passover. Then you have, the Garden of Gethsemane that eventually happens. Um, Jesus tells them in one moment, to sleep, and then he tells them to take rest. There in Matthew 26:45. And then he says, behold, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed in the hands of sinners. And so that is on Thursday, according to a Jewish reckoning of a day. Um, But you have that night that transpires, and
Mhm.
that next morning, that you have Thursday morning, is where you have the betrayal that takes place. And so I call Thursday a day of payment,
Mhm.
because that's what I believe. I believe Jesus died for our sins on Thursday, and so that's where we were.
Yeah, and so I think everybody's aware of what took place, on
Right.
Thursday with the crucifixion, and so then he dies. They want to take him down off the cross
Hmm.
before sunset because of the Sabbath, and that's where the Good Friday comes from because it
Right.
says they wanted to take him down for the preparation for the Sabbath. For that Sabbath
Right.
was a high day, and in reality, it seems like on both sides, on the Wednesday and the Thursday side, we've got our magical proof text where
Right.
it cancels out everything else in the Bible. And so
Right.
for the Catholics, we got, oh, there it is. That proves, Sabbath begins Friday night. Therefore, he died on a Friday.
Yeah.
Over, but then you have, as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the
Right.
whale's belly, you
Right.
can't get 3 days and 3 nights from Friday.
Right.
Therefore, it was Wednesday, magic
Yeah.
verse. So, yeah,
We have a magic verse too in Luke 24. We'll get there in a little bit, I'm assuming.
yeah,
But now's as guess as good a time as any to bring both of those verses have to fit. Again,
right.
there's no contradiction, and so the next day has to be a Sabbath, a high day, and
Hmm.
just so happens that the 15th of Abib is always a high day. Uh,
Right.
it's the first day of unleavened bread. So you have the
Hmm.
Passover, and you can, if anybody's looking, you could look in Leviticus 23. It outlines these feasts in a very readable, linear way that's helpful. And so you have the Passover, and then you have the first day of unleavened bread. And then the following Sunday after Passover is always the Feast of First Fruits. And
Hmm.
so it would have been a high day the next day, even if it's on Thursday. So that would be my response to the Friday guys. But you mentioned, I guess it's Matthew 12:40, where it talks
Hmm.
about the promise of Jonas,
Hmm.
3 days and 3 nights, and that has to fit as well, and I think it
Hmm.
does. I think it does with a Thursday, and
Right.
so I'm not sure if
Well,
you
and I
want to get
think,
into that now or later.
yeah, well, I think we can get into that too because I like how you explain it, and you gave several examples. I don't have any of them in front of me. I don't know if you have them ready, but in your sermon, you gave a bunch of examples. But this happens a lot where we often will take words, phrases, timelines, and things in the Bible, and we will give what I always call, and I say this in kind of an insulting way too, but to get a point across to people, it's like, we're always applying this modern American 21st century, you know, way of accounting for things. And it's like, well, that's not
Sure.
how they put things in the Bible. People in other countries and other times, they word things different. For
Right.
example, I've got some friends from Ireland. And I always get confused when they say the time, and it's just like it's like half three. What does that mean?
Right.
And
Right.
which I think it's 3:30 is what that means. Where we would say half past three, they just say
Right.
half three. Well,
Yeah.
half three, that's one and a half. Uh,
Right. It's one
so
thirty.
yeah. So, the phrase
Yeah.
after 3 days.
Right.
So it's like
Yeah.
in our brains, it's like, okay, today's Wednesday. So, which it's not right now, but so that means Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And so after 3 days, what's is that? Well, that's Sunday. Well, that would
Yeah.
actually be 4 days,
Sure, right,
is how that
right.
works.
And if that's the case, then Sunday would be the fourth day. And so
Mhm.
and this goes back to, I guess, our confirmation bias, where you have verses like, I have an example here, Luke 18:33. It says, "And they shall scourge him and put him to death, and the third day he shall rise again." So
Mhm.
the Bible says Jesus is going to rise the third day. And
Mhm.
then there's other verses like Mark 8:31, where it says he began to teach. Then the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected of the elders and the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise
Mhm.
again. So after three is four, and so
Mhm.
there's this apparent contradiction between, is it the third day or is it after 3 days?
Mhm.
And the examples that I mentioned in the text are letting the Bible define these terms, these phrases. There's two that I think clearly do this. One, if folks were taking notes or want to look this up, Esther chapter 4 verse 16
Mhm.
is where she sends to tell Mordecai and them to fast, for 3 days and 3 nights, night and day. and then she'll go in before the king. Well, then the next chapter, chapter 5, verse 1, it says, and on the third day, she goes in there before the king. And
Hmm.
so, and then the clearest example of that, I think, is with Rehoboam, Second Chronicles chapter 10. So they come to Rehoboam and they say, hey, make our burden lighter. Jeroboam's with them. And he says, come to me again after 3 days. And then the Bible says, that's verse 5. Verse 12, it says, and they came to him on the third day, as he had said, come
Hmm.
again to me on the third day. So in the same passage, it says that he said after 3 days. And then later on, it quotes him again as having said on the third day. And
Hmm.
so we have some biblical examples that show that after 3 days and on the third day mean the same thing. Um, and so that Second Chronicles 10, I think, is the clearest way to look at it, verse 5 and verse 12. So anyway, so
Correct.
that I think helps clear up the fact that when the Bible says that he's going to raise from the dead on the third day and he's going to raise from the dead after 3 days, they mean the same thing.
Yeah, yeah, because again, it's like it is the way we talk today. If I said, "Hey, you've got 3 days to give me $100 you owe me, or I'm sending my
Hmm.
boys after you," right?
Yeah.
So what you would think today in America, it's like, so as the recording of this, we're recording on Thursday. I was like, all right, so that means Friday. We think in terms of like 24 hours, but in
Right.
reality, today is a day, and today is a day you should be getting something done and doing something about it. And so
Sure.
today being Thursday, that's a day. Friday, Saturday, so Saturday is your third day. That's
Right. Yeah.
technically,
Yeah. And
and
that's
that's
the
clearly
Friday
how they.
guys argument. That's the Friday
Yes,
guys. And then you have the other Wednesday guys who say after 3 days has to mean a full 72 hours.
right.
Um, and that's just not how we reckon days.
Hmm.
Pastor Wampler in his message, he gives the illustration of his birthday. He said, I was born at 9 o'clock at night. When I wake up on my birthday, my wife always says, happy birthday that morning,
Hmm.
because it's that day, so
Right.
we're not that specific in the way that we even count days.
Hmm.
If it touches that day, then that day, counts, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So then, um, so for Thursday he dies. So Friday, Saturday, so he would have been dead for part of and in the grave for part of Thursday.
Right. Yeah.
So
Sweet.
and
So
then
I,
all of Thursday night, Friday
right.
morning, Friday night, Saturday morning, Saturday night, rises early Sunday. I mean, it fits
Right.
perfectly.
Right. Yeah. It touches 3 days, the
Mhm.
Thursday, because we know Jesus dies at say 3. So Jesus is
Mhm.
on the cross from the third hour, which is 9 a.m.
Mhm.
for until 3 p.m. So for 6 hours. And remember, they come to Jesus and they don't have to break his legs because he's already
Mhm.
passed. And
Yep.
so, and there are some people who would say, well, his body, when Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus come, it says that it's about even when they bury his body. And so they say, well, then that doesn't, that's when the clock starts for the 3 days and the 3 nights. But I would argue that the 3 days and 3 nights starts when Jesus dies,
Absolutely.
because the
Because he's.
prophecy is about when the promise is about as Jonas was in the whale's belly, so the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and
Mhm.
3 nights.
Right.
And so that happens when he dies. His body never goes to the heart of the earth.
Right.
His body goes in the tomb. And so
Well.
it would have, so that Thursday would have counted if Jesus dies at 3 o'clock on Thursday. That's day
Mhm.
one. Then you have
Yes.
Friday, the light time. That's day two. Saturday, the light time. That's day
Mhm.
three. And Jesus is risen from the dead on Sunday morning before the sun
Mhm.
rises. And
Right.
so I think you can get 3 days and 3 nights from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because he's only got to be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. He's there as soon as he dies, and the significance of getting the body in the tomb, I personally believe, um, the symbol there we see in the Passover is they were supposed to eat all of it, and then
Hmm.
anything that was left, there was to be nothing left over, and they would burn it. People often use that to prove the suffering in hell, which we're not going to get into. I don't think that's proof of it. I think because the Bible is clear to point out that they wanted to get him in the tomb before the sunset because his body was the sacrifice for sins. They weren't going to go roast it because obviously it needs to rise again, but at the same
Right.
time it can't be just left out.
Right.
That would have messed with the sign of the Passover. So the roasting or the burning of the Passover lamb, I believe that was just symbolic of nothing being left over, because it was seen as such a holy thing. You can't just leave it out there. And it was the
Right.
same thing with Jesus' body on the cross. It could not just be left out. It was the sacrifice for sin, and so it was placed in a tomb, before the sun went down. That's what I believe. The
Sure.
significance of that wasn't why it's mentioned.
Yes, sir. Yeah, no, I agree with that. But I don't even really focus as much in the message or even in this argument about the body,
Mhm.
because to me that's not what Matthew 12:40 is about. And so
Mhm.
I don't think it holds a lot of weight in the conversation, about
Right.
this. So
Yeah. Now, is there anything specific? I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head right now, but like on the Friday, like, do we have any significant stories that take place on the Friday or the Saturday while Jesus was in the tomb? It doesn't appear much. The Bible doesn't really record much of what went on during that time.
No, sir. No, sir. For the apostles or for Jesus, and I know that that's
Mm.
an interesting study, is what takes place between the death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ. I think my pastor's preached a message along those lines before, but you're not
Mm.
going to reference the Gospels a lot in that message, because
No.
it's not something that's covered. So I put in the message where I went through the week, I put those 2 days together, Friday and Saturday, and I just called them, days of patience,
Yeah.
that's taking place. You have the unleavened. We know, because of Leviticus 23, you have the feast of unleavened bread that's taking place, and that leaven is a type of sin. And so there's a great picture in that of Jesus. There's no leaven there; it's being taken
Mhm.
away. And so that is as far as my commentary goes on those days.
Mhm. Well, and it makes sense now. And this was something that you guys brought up in your message that I had not thought of too, that I thought was very interesting. Um, and I think this the what this represents couldn't be more clear. But it would make sense that not much even happened with the disciples during that time, because again, that feast of unleavened bread,
Yeah.
that was a special Sabbath, because
Right.
people have this idea that Sabbath is just Saturday, but no,
Yeah.
there were other Sabbaths that they had, and
Right.
in John, it even references something special about that Sabbath. So if it's not just referring to a Saturday, it makes sense if there is such a thing as another Sabbath, which you can find those in the law. It makes sense that it's specified as a special one. And it
Right.
was because of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but nothing much would have been going on
Right.
during that time that Jesus was in the grave. And you guys talk about that a lot. You want to share just kind of the significance of that? Because I think that's very interesting.
Sure.
Really, nothing took place in between the
Right.
death, during the time that Jesus was dead.
Yeah, and I think it has to do with why Jesus dies. Jesus dies to take away our sin. And so,
Hmm.
and I'm not saying that anybody that preaches a Wednesday is adding works to salvation, but I do think that the picture is clear. As you said, you have Thursday, which is Passover. It's and once a year Sabbath, if you will, a holy day that no work's being done, or no servile work. And then you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The first day and the last day of unleavened bread were always high days or Sabbath
Hmm.
days. And so if Jesus dies on Thursday, you have Thursday Passover, no work's being done. Friday is the first day of unleavened bread, no work is being done. You have Saturday, which is always a Sabbath. And then you have Sunday, which the Sunday following Passover, according to Leviticus 23, is always the Feast of First Fruits. And so no work being done. And so the entire time when Jesus is taking care of our sin, if you will, Jesus, he doesn't allow any work to be done. And so I think
Hmm.
that's a great picture of salvation. It's always been by grace through faith, no works being added. And so, but if Jesus dies on Wednesday, then you have Wednesday Passover, Thursday first day of unleavened bread, and then Friday it's back to work. Everybody,
Hmm.
and so I think, to me, that messes with the picture, and God cares about His pictures. And so,
Absolutely.
you
And
know,
it's perfect. While I mean, the gospel is the death, burial, and resurrection. And during that time that he is, in the heart of the earth, his body is in the grave, no work is being done. And when it comes to people getting saved, that's how you get saved. You believe on that. You're not doing any work. And so,
mm,
yeah, I thought I never really thought about the fact that all of those that entire time, that was a time of no work, and
Right.
that makes perfect sense.
Sure.
And yeah, and that it doesn't work right necessarily if it's on Wednesday, does it?
No, sir, no. And now if it's Friday, then it would.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
again, I think you can't get 3 days and 3 nights out of Friday.
Right.
And so, the best arguments for Wednesday disprove Friday, the best arguments for Friday disprove Wednesday.
Mm.
Thursday is, seems to answer all those questions.
Yeah, and you do you have Mark that does give a very clear outline. I think that it just clears
Right.
things up, and I think a lot of times, it's kind of my habit if I'm looking at going through some of the Bible, I always go to Matthew first. But for this subject, Mark is really the best one you want to go to. It definitely has the most specifics on that. So, yeah. So, do you have any other things to add to that, or is that kind of the gist of it? I think that's probably about as much as I
Yeah,
know on
that
the
that's
subject.
the gist of it as far
Hmm.
as the fact that when you count the days,
Hmm.
it makes sense after 3 days and on the third day. Um, well, I guess probably I'll end with our strongest verse that I think deals with
Oh
this,
yeah.
and it's in Luke 24. Um, in Luke 24. I'll just mention it where Jesus is on the road to Emmaus with those two disciples, and they're sad. Jesus says, "Why are y'all sad?" And they say, "Are you a stranger? Don't you know?" They talk about Jesus and how he's been crucified, and then they make the statement that today is
Hmm.
the third day
Yes.
since these things came to pass. And so, to me, that is our you mentioned the other days have their go-to verses. If I had just
Hmm.
one verse to talk about, maybe I should have led with it, not closed with it, but that would be the one where I go to. If Jesus dies on Wednesday, you cannot make, if you count Wednesday or if you don't count Wednesday,
Hmm.
you can't make Sunday the third day
Right.
from Wednesday. And so actually, I was talking with my son. I've got twin boys that are 8. And I was talking with them. I said, "I'm gonna go on this, podcast." And by the
Mhm.
way, I have officially peaked today. My ministry, it's all downhill from here. So on the Spirit of Prophecy podcast, I've peaked already. But I was talking with them about what we were going to be talking about. And my son's 8 years old. I'm not trying to denigrate anybody, but my son's 8 years old, and he says, "Well, Dad, if Sunday is the third day, then Jesus dies on Thursday." And I said, "Well, yes, son, that is true." But they make the statement there, and that'd be my go-to verse if I had one verse.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I'm definitely convinced. I said I was almost there before I listened, but it did, some of the stuff you guys mentioned there, I was like, it just kind of gave me the confirmation. And I really just had to, in my mind, reconcile that one verse as far as how to apply it in Mark 14. And one thing I try very hard to do on this program when it comes to and this has helped me from listening to other people's perspectives on things. It's just like I'm always asking, how am I coming to my conclusions? And um, there are passages where we do sometimes we go looking for what we've already decided is there, and so we read it a certain way, and then we use it as a proof text for something. It's like, well, no, that verse could be applied a lot of different ways. So we have to see if there's something in the Bible somewhere that makes it, that clarifies that. And I feel like the verses that are causing them to go wrong, it is those vague verses, and those become their proof text. And it's like, no, hang on a second, you know, this one verse here that you're insisting is interpreted this way, you need to prove why it's okay for you to interpret that way. And I feel like when it comes to Mark 14, I think it was Matthew 26 that you
Yes, sir.
referred to, proves how you interpret Mark 14. And then that was like the final thing I just needed settled in my mind. And so I really said I really enjoyed the message. And again, folks watching this, I only gave the disclaimer about Pastor Wagner for his sake. I don't want any of the weirdos that follow me to like go to his church and think he's just like me or something like that on certain things and cause problems. Uh, and man, that would make that kind of thing aggravates me, because as much as I love what I believe and what we teach and stuff in this program. I tell people all the time, there are so many people and there are so many wonderful churches out there who don't agree with me on everything. And it's just like, and if you can't get along there, and I've told people on my side this before that just have problems with, pre-trib and stuff. I'm sorry. I refuse to live in a world where I can't like people like this, fellowship with people like this. They're good folks. They're good preachers. They love the Lord. And maybe they're even right in some of these things where we're wrong, so it's like,
Well, I've been right once now. I've been right one time. So we've been able to persuade you one time on this. We've got our foot in the door. And
Mhm.
so we're glad that you came out of the closet as a Thursday guy. And I am a regular listener to the Spirit of Prophecy, and I would recommend it. Even
Well,
though I get trashed on there sometimes, I enjoy it because I know you're coming from it. You're coming to that from a good perspective, a Bible believer, and so I can handle it. So I
well, yeah,
appreciate it.
yeah, and it's like I said, it's never personal because
Right.
I
Yeah.
think I've proven I get along with the pre-trib dispensational world and all that, and I think there's certain characters in that world that I think are terrible, but
Right.
a lot of you
Sure.
guys would probably feel the same way too
Yes.
on
No.
that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well,
And
I would hate to be painted with the broadest brush of everyone that claims those titles. Um, and as I'm sure you would, there's some folks
yeah.
probably that would agree more with you that you would rather not be identified with or tied to. So
Well, yeah, I've talked to people before too, where we'll be talking about a certain preacher, and then when like one I really like, and people they'll ask me like, well, what's his position? I was like, I don't know, and I don't want to find out because I like him, and I don't want anything to change my mind, and so
sure.
I'm
Sure.
I'm never gonna ask,
Yeah.
and
There you go.
and I was just last night in church. I was referencing, and I don't know this man personally. I briefly met him one time years ago. I've heard him preach in person multiple times, but I don't know if do you ever listen to Pastor Joe Arthur? I I I love Pastor Joe
Yes,
Arthur's
sir.
preaching.
Yeah.
I love listening to him preach, and you know he I'm always encouraged.
Yep.
I always truly enjoy it, and his style is 100% different than mine. You know,
Yes. Yes, it
but
is.
I wish I could. I wish I could. I probably could preach like that if I wanted to. If I was in a southern church where I
Yeah.
had the right kind of audience, I think I could do it. But
Yeah.
what I love about his preaching is while it's the most of the sermons I've heard, it's been like at camp meetings and conferences, and it's just kind of like fire you up, encouraging. There's always like some deep nugget of truth or something that just gets you thinking. That
Right.
like after I don't know if I've ever heard him preach a sermon where he didn't say something in there that like I'm like thinking about it for like the next days afterwards and just kind of pondering on it
Yeah.
and stuff like that. And I absolutely love that. And I hate how political everybody is in the IFB. He gets creamed
Yeah.
all the time because
He
of
gets
people
hit
he
on both
preached before.
sides.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I will. And anytime I've ever seen him getting attacked on social media, I'm always defending him because
Yeah.
I'm glad. Is to me, I don't care who he preaches for as long as they're not changing him. And I've not seen that. He to me he still preaches like I heard first time I heard him like 15 years ago or something like that.
Yeah.
So I don't have a problem with that, but on our side too, we're the same way. And it's like, well, what's this? It's like, I don't want to know. It's like, and
Yeah.
I, I'm for him either way. And somebody's going to go find a clip of him saying something. Just like, I don't even want
Christ
to
is
care.
preached. Paul said, "I'm glad as Christ is preached." So
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
happy with
Yep.
that.
And I don't know how he would do. He probably would do great up here in Illinois. It's Joe Arthur, but, yeah, he's in Georgia, right?
Yeah, he pastors in Atlanta, I believe it
That's right.
is, around Atlanta. So, yeah, but all of his meetings are in the South. He was right down the road from us just a little while, I guess last week, and so he's
He
encouraging for
he's
sure.
preached a couple times up here in Illinois,
Right.
at a meeting
Yeah.
I've gone to, and
He He's close with brother Brian McBride, he's up there in Indiana. I think he's from Bean Blossom, Indiana, and so we've
Okay.
got some Yankees that come down south and preach to us, and they're a novelty. Folks drive from miles around to check them out. So
Yeah.
yeah,
But yeah, no, he's one of the good ones. But I guess yeah, I just say all that to just one of the goals of this program is it to just not be political and to encourage Baptists not be political. I think every Baptist ought to stand by their convictions. And if some guy, he's got some teaching that you can't then don't fellowship with them. But at the same time, if it's just if this is somebody is a good guy that loves the Lord and it's some minor difference and you're going to let politics stop you, I just think that's lame and kind of pathetic personally. And so,
yeah,
we try to set an example on this program, and because it's like there are, while there is a variety of Baptists, I think a lot of us should be able to just like get along pretty good
yeah,
and like each other and stuff. And so,
yeah.
um, yeah, there's some I don't like, but it's, but
There's some that agree with me, 100% on most of these doctrinal issues that I don't like. So
yeah.
it happens. Personalities, people. It is what it is. But I appreciate the opportunity to come on, and like I said, I'm a listener, and I have officially peaked. So I've reached the pinnacle of my career, if you will.
Well, I mean,
Being with you.
hopefully, I don't know how political the crowd is that you run with, though. But hopefully, it doesn't get you canceled. But
Yeah.
never everybody's going to accuse you of being a post tribber or something like that. And
That's fine. I don't mind a little controversy, and so it is what it is. I don't think that'll happen though. Lord's give us some good friends in the ministry, and so I'm glad to be able to come on here and make another one.
yeah, well, I mean, if you're a product of Brother Wampler's ministry, he doesn't give a rip about that
Yeah.
stuff. And that's
Right.
why I like him. I
Yes,
like
sir.
guys that just don't give a rip.
Yep.
It's like what camp's he in? I have no idea. Those are the ones I like.
Yes, sir.
So. Hey man. Well, all right. Well, hey, I hope you all enjoyed this. And so, here in the next week or so, as people start fighting with each other over between Wednesday and Friday, we've helped you hopefully have an opinion, and you can be the contrarian and jump in, and you can look at it as a way we can all compromise and meet in the middle at Thursday, or just one more
Yeah.
area we can divide. So,
Right.
but anyway, well, thank you all for watching. God bless you, and we will see y'all next time.